The Modern Slavery Act is seen as a landmark piece of legislation, and it's one that recognises and seeks to address the problem of the proliferation of slavery and the new face that this crime has taken on in our modern world, in our modern globalised world. There's estimated to be over 43 million slaves across the world today, according to the Global Slavery Index. Many of their lives are stuck in bonded labour and supply chains of legitimate businesses across the world. And recognising this, the Act is the first national piece of legislation of its kind to include transparency in the supply chain. And as you will know, this requires all companies that have an operating turnover of more than 36 million a year to annually publish statements detailing what they are doing to eradicate slavery from their supply chain and their business. It recognises that slavery is not confined to the illicit underworld economy. Rather, it is deeply connected to the inner workings of our globalised world, thriving in the very structures and socio-economic threads that hold our world together. It is a cog in our economic machine, manifesting itself in a hidden underworld, but interacting with the legitimate economy and intrinsically linked to the global supply chain. Today, it is a debt, desperation and fear, not guns and chains, which trap millions in slavery. Unscrupulous labour brokers, recruiters and gangmasters are exploiting the most vulnerable who are desperate to provide a living for their families. They look for jobs overseas and are promised great opportunities on false promises and extortionate recruitment fees, which result in debt and suffering for many years to come. The kind of exploitation currently occurring globally cannot be accepted as business as usual for this contemporary society. Governments, citizens, and crucially businesses need to work to ensure our economy and our societies are not based on a business model that allows for exploitation. Your company may well be profiting from the stolen wages of hard-working workers. Forced labour is theft from the most vulnerable of our society. It is monetary theft, but it is also the theft of freedom. It is not simply an auditing issue, not just a case of business malpractice, it is a criminal practice. And I say this not to scaremonger amongst you, but to highlight the gravity of this issue and why this legislation is so important for sparking change within industry. Undoubtedly, the Transparency in Supply Chain clause has pushed the issue of modern slavery up the agenda into the boardrooms of large businesses. It is now facing companies to look at this and actually asking them to do things that they haven't done before. Yet this clause is just the first step, and there are undeniably challenges in monitoring compliance and ensuring that reporting then translates to greater accountability. We need to see companies produce statements that both comply with the Act's requirements, but also, importantly, that they point to decisive action and are not just merely tick box exercises. A modern slavery statement alone will not eliminate forced labour. It is just one tool in the box. It is the mechanism to motivate change that will actually cause change itself. The fruit of its success will be in the practical actions that companies decide to take to ensure that no worker in their supply chain is exploited. And indeed, that is what we need to do, just like we do around other things. For example, those who manufacture aircraft have to know where every part of that aircraft comes from. Those who have quality standards need to know where every piece and part of the products they produce come from. So why can't we know where all the people we employ are and the conditions they live in? This clause affects 17,000 companies across the UK. But of course, it is large companies that control other smaller companies, and they can actually cause the change in those smaller companies by requiring them to have certain standards. Because slavery is only profitable insofar as that somebody is willing to buy the goods and that is normally a company at the top of the chain. The merit of the transparency in supply chain clause lies in the fact that it is non-punitive. We do not want businesses to actively be in fear of punishment. We want problems to be brought to the light and proactively addressed. Challenges and difficulties need to be aired, not hidden away. Only then can we begin to find solutions and protect the most vulnerable workers from exploitation and abuse. For example, Unilever bought Lipton's teas knowing that it was rife with exploitation and worked hard to ensure the workers in its supply chain were fairly treated, and they continue to do so, whilst also recognising and being transparent about the fact that they have not yet managed to eliminate all the slavery and exploitation, but they continue to work and to deal with those challenges. That's what this Act has brought about. This open discussion could not be possible if the transparency in the supply chain clause was modelled along the lines of the UK Bribery Act. We want companies to do what Unilever did and reform rather than simply avoid suppliers with slavery in their supply chains and allow the suffering to continue. The great parliamentarian and abolitionist William Wilberforce, who obviously spoke in this very House and made the legislation back in 1807 to eradicate slavery in the transatlantic days, said in this House, "You may choose to look the other way, but you can never say again that you did not know." In our interconnected world today, we can go as far to say that we may choose to look the other way, but we cannot say we're not complicit. We just don't know where every part of slavery is, but we do know it exists. And one thing we can be certain of is it is in your supply chains. It's in the supply chains of the companies, the clothes that we wear, the phones that we use, and the food that we eat. So it's interconnected with us every single day. Abolition today seems far more complex than it was in the times of the transatlantic slave trade, which required a simple treaty and the deployment of the British Navy into the Atlantic. But let's not forget that Wilberforce and his allies had to make huge institutional change and put years of hard graft into shifting cultural attitudes towards the way that business and society functioned. And so too must we. What if Wilberforce had not spoken up? What then? For how long would that slavery have persisted? So it's up to us, in our interconnected world, in our easy ways to communicate, in our easy ways of creating self-regulation, that we can do what he did. So we must embark on the same journey to address the structures and cultural attitudes in our society and the factors in our economy that allow slavery to thrive once again. We need huge cultural change, and this cannot be done by legislation alone. It needs to be done by leaders, but not leaders just in politics, not leaders just in law enforcement or statutory agencies. It's leaders such as yourselves. As I say, the political need is essential. And today we've got that lead in the Prime Minister, who has actually said that modern slavery is the greatest human rights issue of our time. The greatest. That shows the leadership that the government and the Prime Minister in particular is showing. But it needs leadership, as I say, from everybody in this room. The fact that the UK is now being recognised as a global leader in the fight against trafficking in places like the lofty halls of the United Nations headquarters is no solace to someone trapped in slavery. Somebody who's feeling lost, often in a foreign country, hopeless and scared of the fear of violence at the hands of their trafficker. And slave drivers and exploiters do not care what the Independent Anti-Slavery Commissioner says, or what the Secretary of State says, or indeed what the Prime Minister says. They only care when their profits are hit, their business models are destroyed, and they can no longer operate, and very often end up in prison. That is when they will take us seriously. So you in business in this room are in a position to put slave drivers out of business. Now is the time to act. Your presence here demonstrates to me a desire to create change. Change in the way that business is done, change in the way that you employ people, change in the way that we value people above simple profit as pound notes. So it's important that we do work together. And I want to tell you about personal circumstances of where people end up in slavery. Here in London, I have seen children as young as 7 working as slaves. Only yesterday, I was talking to the Irish police about a whole group that are operating across the British Isles with people who are in the industry of refuge collection, who are in modern-day slavery. Or a Polish gang that had over 300 people working in the construction industry who were being trafficked all around the United Kingdom. Those people were being beaten, being made to live on construction sites, were being hurt, not being allowed to go to hospital, and as punishment, were not allowed to go home on Christmas Day. That is what is happening in businesses up and down the United Kingdom. But behind every single one of these is a human life that's being destroyed. And it's not always in the Far East. It's not always in Latin America or Eastern Europe. Sometimes it's within a mile of this very building. So we have all got the chance as leaders to do that, lead, but to lead to make sure that slavery doesn't remain profitable and that we as the United Kingdom do as we say we're going to do and lead globally to eradicate this so that the lives of those who are suffering are restored and that they can live free as we do and as we take for granted. Thank you very much.
So breaking my own rules, because Kevin needs to shoot off. Does anybody have any questions or comments they'd like to make on that address you just heard? Well, while you're thinking about it, I'll ask one, possibly even 2. So given the nature of the Modern Slavery Act and how you've set it out to encourage, well, everything from participation to eradication of the issues, what's the feedback been from industry? Because, of course, it is an unusually sort of arranged act in the way that you talk about. So what has the feedback been?
Well, initially when it came in, there was obviously rabbit in the headlights, I think is a good expression, that people didn't know what it expected. And there was a lot of people coming forward saying, we can give you advice. But actually, if you look at the way that the many complicated things that you do, procurement, health and safety rules, when you do estimates and so forth for big contracts, you've got a lot of skills in your organisations. And actually, it's about your organisation understanding where the risk is and then doing processes. So actually, the feedback I get, and from when I meet, with CEOs and companies, I haven't heard one company say this is a bad idea. I haven't heard one say it's not going to work. Quite the opposite. However, sometimes they don't know what to do next. But I think companies need to take responsibility. Once it sits in the company as a response, within your own systems, look for where the risk is. Yes, you may need advice elsewhere. But when you look at things like your accounts, your auditing, you go to big companies to get that done. This can't be done in the back of a room with somebody with an Excel spreadsheet. This needs to be done professionally, just like all the other audits you do. But I think generally across the industry, and what's really interesting is internationally when I go abroad, there are so many different countries. For example, in Southeast Asia, the BRE process is looking at how they can adopt this to the 45 countries in that region. The Consumer Goods Forum wants to work alongside this, the ETI. So within the sector, and particularly UK companies, there's a lot happening. And I've been to Vietnam and seen what some of the British companies are doing there. And they're doing far more than anybody anticipated. And they are leading the way. But actually, it needs everybody doing it, because if one gap's formed, then that's where the criminals move into.
Question at the front here.
Well, thanks. I'm Tristan Forster from ASI. I'm talking a bit later about the Gulf and recruitment into the Gulf.
You've got a mic, actually.
Thank you very much. You've mentioned that there are
people in labour supply chains in large numbers paying large amounts of money to get their jobs. Clearly, that is, if that's happening in a company's labour supply chain, a British company's labour supply chain, that's an offence under Section 7 of the Bribery Act, as well as, as the implications for the Modern Slavery Act. Do you see Modern Slavery Act legislation and Bribery Act legislation coming together, perhaps to focus people's attention?
I think at the moment, for the reasons I said, modern slavery is about, when you're dealing with money laundering and bribery, if you see it, you have to keep away from it. There's a reporting requirement, but you keep away from it. It's not your job as a company to go in and sort it out. With modern slavery, we'd like to see companies going in and sorting it out. It's no good a company buying something and then being prosecuted for buying it because there's that going on. I know there is a conflation or sometimes a connection between bribery, and that is something that is clearly needs to be considered. I think in time, the Modern Slavery Act may become punitive, and I think that demand will come from companies and industries, because if we've got really ethical companies doing a great deal to make sure that their companies and their supply chains are slavery free, and others are doing nothing, business themselves will be saying, come on, let's create a level playing field, and that may need stronger legislation. But I think at the initial part, I think it's fair to give companies an opportunity to clean up their acts, and I think that's in the best interest of the people who are suffering.
Okay, we'll take a quick one. Jim, you've had your hand up, so go for it. Oh, we're going down the front. I've lost control of the microphone. Turn around. The fellow there waving with the orange tie. We'll go by tie colour, it'll be easier.
Thank you. Quick one. Jim McClelland, editor at SysMeme. The Supply Chain School did a survey asking respondents whether they thought modern slavery was an issue on which the UK should be seen to take a lead, and a massive 84% said yes, absolutely. I just wanted to ask you how you saw the UK's position on this being perceived abroad by other countries. How is the UK seen on this?
So the UK was pushed for a sustainable development goal, 8.7, to have eradication of modern slavery. So internationally, the UK is seen as being a global lead. I recently attended an event in the UN with heads of state and heads of countries, and they are seeing and asking the UK for more and more advice about the legislation, particularly supply chain transparency. So internationally, we are seen as taking the lead. Your figure of 84%, the problem is in the UK, Hull University did some research recently, and they found that 8% of the general public only knew really what slavery was and its interconnection. So there's a lot more to be done domestically to make sure the awareness is raised. But I think internationally, we get inquiries all the time from other governments and other authorities about how we introduce the legislation, what it means, and how they could work on getting similar legislation, and particularly working with things like the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, Bali process, G20. So it is seen as a priority, and obviously the UK government is pushing this as a priority now. Right, we're to time, and I can't break my own rules anymore. Thank you very much. That was highly insightful, as it always is, and I know you've got to shoot off. If you've got any further questions, if you send them in to us at BRE, we can get them across to Kevin and get a response for you.